What's going on YouTube? It was such a nice day. I had to get on the bike and I figured I'd make a little video of my first impressions of this 2012 Aprilia RSV4. I've always wanted to try one of these bikes because I think they're great value for what you pay. Comparing it to my 2012 R1, same year, same style of sport bike. I picked this Aprilia up for much less money and it has half the kilometers and twice as many rider assist features. So extremely good value. Basically a MotoGP bike for the street. But let's get right into the good stuff. So initially, tossing a leg of this bike, the very first thing I felt was how light it is. For a 1000cc bike, it is way lighter than any other bike I've tried. And I've owned CBR 1000 RRs, I've owned many R1s, and this is hands down way lighter, like not even close, no comparison. It feels very similar to my 09 R6. The seating style, the weight balance, the brake input, all very similar to the R6, but with leader bike power. It's the best balance between weight and power that I've ever felt. And speaking of weight and brake input, it takes half the effort to stop this bike thanks to these big Brembos up front. Compared to my R1, this thing stops on a dime. Literally takes twice as much brake input on my R1 compared to this bike. I'm a one finger braker on the front, and the R1, if you're hard on the front brakes, I'm almost at the point where I need two fingers to fully stop that R1. This Aprilia, you can basically panic stop one finger front brake effortlessly. And the brakes on my R1 aren't bad. They're still good brake calipers, but this is just on a whole nother level. Performance wise, it's basically a similar setup to the R1. It's got an intake, exhaust, and ECU flash from the dealer. But the power on this bike is very smooth, very linear through the whole RPM range. Not like the R1, where it's kind of a little bit of a dog down low and then punches you in the face up top. This Aprilia is very easy to ride. It doesn't feel like it punches as hard as my R1 up top, but it could be just from how smooth the bike is. I am going to race both these bikes head to head to actually find out for sure, but it'll be very interesting to see the outcome. I think this bike is deceivingly fast. It's so smooth, you don't realize how fast you're going. Now let's talk about the engine a little bit. So this is a V4 1000cc displacement. My R1 is also a leader bike, 1000cc displacement. Comparing the crossplane crankshaft in my R1 and this V4, they sound very similar when you're on the pipe. They're both a little bit of a dog in the low RPM, and they both run hot. So if you guys know crossplane engines, everybody complains about how hot they run. A lot of heat under the seat area because I have twin pipes coming out right under the seat on that bike, and the catalytic converter sits right under there too. But the heat on that bike is absolutely nothing compared to this V4. The Aprilia runs hot. And I'm not talking coolant temp hot. The frame just radiates heat. Just how this engine is mounted and how tight it is with the frame. When you have your legs kind of tight against the tank and you're touching this frame, if you're stopped in traffic, it's to the point where you can't keep your legs touching that frame or you'll burn yourself. As hot as my R1 gets, the frame does not get hot like this. So very different styles of heat input. The R1 coolant temp physically gets hotter than this Aprilia, but it's still more comfortable to ride, even in start and stop traffic, even with the exhaust right under the seat. So let that sink in, how hot this frame is on the Aprilia. I find myself very often spreading my legs and just getting a little bit of airflow between me and the frame. It gets that bad. I've never complained about heat on any other bike except this. This is the first. Heat has never bothered me before. But as long as you're not slow speed, start and stop traffic for too long, the frame doesn't stay that hot once you're over 50 kilometers an hour or something like that for an extended period of time. It's just at those slow speeds. And on top of the performance that this bike has, it just sounds very unique. The V4 probably doesn't get picked up on camera that well, but it sounds very deep and throaty. Similar to my Crossplane R1, but still different. It adds a layer of character for the rider to enjoy. This V4 engine sounds amazing when you're listening to the pipe, but if you're listening to the engine itself, it has a lot of valve train noise, a lot of chain noise, a lot of just noise in general that doesn't sound good. And trust me, I'm used to my Crossplane R1. That bike has some noise down low at idle too that doesn't sound like a traditional flat plane bike, but this V4 is on another level. Way more valve train noise. And it kind of makes sense, right? You got 2 cylinder heads, twice as many cams. When you're comparing it to a traditional inline 4 bike, you have double of everything. So it makes sense that it has twice as much valve train noise to me. That's just kind of how they are. And you're gonna have to live with it if you have one of these bikes. Not the end of the world, but it does sound pretty clattery. So this V4 with the ECU flash from the dealer and my R1 with a dyno tune flash uploaded to that ECU as well, they both should make around 200 horse and they both get horrible fuel mileage. The V4 is no exception to that. Which one gets worse mileage? It's hard to say. I haven't spent enough time on this bike yet. I think this bike has a little smaller tank. So if you compare liter to liter, not tank for tank, I think the Aprilia might be a little bit better, but I'll have to wait and see. Moving to the front of the bike, I'm not a huge fan of the triple headlight design. The headlights do work well. The thing that I don't like, when you turn your high beams on, your low beams actually turn off. I think all 3 lights should stay on at the same time with a high beam. It would be way better, a little more safe, but Aprilia doesn't do that. Moving up to the mirrors, they look decent. They're fairly useless. Just the positioning of them, you really can't see past your arms at all. A lot of people complain about this, and after hopping on this and trying it, I agree 100%. The mirror location is probably worse than any other bike I've rode. This is roughly how much you'll see kind of in the driver's point of view here. You have to tuck your arm if you want to see anything behind you. You're only using about a quarter, half of that mirror at best. And at the back of the bike, the tail section is so small, you really can't put anything in here. Insurance papers, that's literally it. No phone, no wallet, nothing. So compared to the R1 has a massive storage compartment. This thing is non-existent. Looks amazing, nice and sleek, but functional, not very functional at all. It's a race bike. Moving on to the electronics of the bike. So this is basically a first gen V4. A lot of these electronics, not very user friendly. So when I'm toggling through all these menus here, I actually had to Google how to use some of this stuff because it's just not user friendly at all. So some of it's pretty straightforward. Toggle through some of this, your launch control settings. The button input isn't very nice. Sometimes you have to toggle this button quite a few times. It's a little bit notchy. Then you have plus and minus buttons on your bar here. So those settings are pretty straightforward, but on the main menu here, this is where I was running into issues. So this was traction control, and yeah, you can toggle that right from your buttons here. So that's still pretty straightforward. I didn't actually know how to use the different power modes because there's actually no buttons or no options in the display to toggle between power modes. The button is the starter button. If it wasn't for the internet these days, I never would have found that out. You have to have the bike running, and then you hit the starter button after it's running, and then it'll toggle between the power modes. So little things like that, little quirky things with an Italian style bike that take a lot to get used to. Is it a big deal? No, but it's just not very user friendly in my opinion. And then to activate the launch control, you have to hold a couple buttons at the same time. And there's different display modes. So if I hold this button over, I think, now we have a race mode. And like, none of these buttons are labeled. Like if somebody doesn't tell you that, you're never gonna know about these features on this bike. And then to activate launch, plus and minus here at the same time. Now launch is active. Like, a lot of stuff to kind of remember. It probably took me a good week or two before I found out all the little quirks of this bike and every feature that it actually has. So definitely not user friendly. So this bike has a lot of features: ABS, traction control, launch control, wheelie control, quick shifter. When I first bought the bike, I was like, yeah, launch control, it's gonna be so sick. And some of the other stuff, wheelie control, I was super excited to try all that. But honestly, you'll never guess what my favorite feature is: the quick shifter. The quick shifter feels so good, and you use it all the time. Not like the launch control, wheelie control, all that stuff where you don't really use it that much. Cool to have, but the quick shifter, you just spend so much time with it. And I thought, how much better can a quick shifter really be compared to my old bike? And let me tell you, after you ride one, you don't want to ride anything without a quick shifter. It's so good, I almost want to add it to my R1 if I keep that bike. It is that good. Such a positive feel to it, and it just adds to the riding experience every time you get on this bike. And just touching on some of the other tech, so the launch control is pretty cool. It doesn't work that much better than, say, my R1 with nothing. When you activate it, grab a handful of wide open throttle, it almost over revs a little bit and then pulls the RPM down. To me, it just feels like a first gen system. It doesn't feel super smooth, seamless. It kind of seems like it was put on there as an afterthought, if that makes sense. I had a little bit higher expectations going into the launch control. Like, does it work? Yeah, it works. Is it gonna blow you away? I don't really think so. An experienced rider, I could launch just as hard on my R1. It just takes a little bit of the guesswork out for you, and it is relatively smooth once you're letting off that clutch. So it's not aggressive enough where you're gonna wheelie out of the hole. It's there, it works, does the job. It's just not that crazy where I want to use it at every set of lights, you know? It doesn't give me that excitement. And I'm pretty surprised, because that's one of the main reasons I bought this bike, was to try some of that cool tech. The wheelie control, I'm used to riding bikes with obviously none of this technology on it. I do feel like it is a little bit too aggressive, even on its lowest setting, just dumping the clutch kind of mid RPM and on throttle. I feel like the bike should be coming up faster, and the electronics are cutting in a little bit more than I'm used to. And first impressions, I don't like that, because I am fairly used to the raw riding experience. I think it's just something you would have to get used to on this bike and have more seat time. I haven't had enough seat time. I've only put about 500 kilometers on it. So really need more seat time to get a good feel for some of these riding electronics and assist features. But right now, definitely not too impressed with the wheelie control. Maybe the traction control is kind of amplifying on top of the wheelie control, but I haven't really tested the traction control either, so really just need more seat time. I can't comment too much more on the electronic side of things, but that quick shifter, just know the quick shifter is amazing. Probably not as smooth as a Ducati. If you read some of the forums and stuff, people complain about these being a little bit more clunky compared to a Ducati, but compared to no quick shifter, it is amazing. If you've never tried a quick shifter at all, you'll definitely love this bike. It's starting to rain here, so I'm gonna have to wrap up this video, but that pretty much sums everything up. So just to recap a little bit, basically feels just like a 600. The chassis, the riding position, seating position, seat height, cornering, kind of braking input. Braking input is still better than the R6 as well, so it is crazy how this bike handles. You can definitely tell it's basically a race bike. And then you have that leader bike power punch behind you. So kind of best of both worlds. Tons of power, no weight. It feels better than I thought it would be. I honestly bought this bike because my R1 was down getting some work done, ECU flash, stuff like that. And I had the intentions of selling this bike after, but it's been so good. I don't know if I'm gonna sell this Aprilia anymore. I might sell the R1 instead. This bike is that good. If this Aprilia looked as good as my R1 does, there'd be no question I'd keep the Aprilia all day long, sell the R1. But the R1, like, something about it, it just looks so good to me. So it's gonna be a really hard decision. If you had a 2012 R1 and this 2012 Aprilia, which one would you keep, guys? I'm not gonna keep both. And this is an extremely hard decision for me. So help me out in the comments below. And there will be many more videos of this Aprilia coming up, so stay tuned for that. Quick shot of the R1 here, so you can see just how much better it looks in person than the Aprilia in the background. Just my opinion, but if I do decide to sell the R1, it'll be an extremely hard decision. And one last thing to talk about while I'm thinking about it, both of these bikes are hard to start compared to a traditional crotch rocket. The crossplane R1s are notoriously hard starting bikes. I think a little bit worse than the Aprilia. I've had the R1 physically not start many times to the point where the battery would die, things like that. The Aprilia, it does crank over for a little bit longer. It does stumble a little bit on the initial catch when it fires, flares up a bit, but it always does start. So the Aprilia does start easier than the R1. And they both have upgraded lithium-ion batteries, both the same size, 280 cca. So a pretty fair comparison that way. R1 still takes the cake for hard starting. And seeing both of these bikes side by side here, make sure you drop a comment below. Let me know which one you would keep, because I'm having a really hard time trying to choose. I like hearing input from other riders. I think the value of these bikes would be pretty similar if I went to sell them. Keep in mind, the crossplane R1 has 32,000 kilometers. The Aprilia only has 14,000.